Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hanink here with fellow panelists Mario Ramos-Reyes and Valerie Niemeyer, who's here but having a little bit of technical difficulty. Today, we discuss the prosperity gospel as the tip of an unholy alliance between individualism in theology and philosophy and capitalism in economics. This alliance reaches into the larger culture, and that includes education, science, and the arts. We have a welcome and returning guest, Thomas Storck, to help us out. He's the author of several books, most recently, The Prosperity Gospel, How Greed and Bad Philosophy Distorted Christ's Teachings. That's from TAN, just this year. Arouca Press has published a revised edition of his Foundations of a Catholic Political Order last year. In addition, he recently translated and wrote a new foreword for Cardinal Billot's Liberalism, a critique of its basic principles in various forms, again from Arouca in 2019. He's a regular contributor to the New Oxford Review, and to top it off, he's associated with the American Solidarity Party. Let's begin in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of thy faithful, and enkindle in them the fire of thy love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. Let us pray. O God, who have taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that in the same Spirit we may be truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation. Through Christ our Lord.
Amen.
Thomas, just what is the prosperity gospel, and who are some of its main proponents?
Well, it's a kind of a bizarre theology. I shouldn't say kind of, it's a bizarre theology that has arisen in Protestant circles, mainly. Preachers such as Joel Osteen or Osteen and Paul White are some of its most notable protagonists. And basically it preaches that God wants us, not only does God have a plan for our lives, which is true, but he wants us to be wealthy, have good relationships, have everything basically going for us well in a worldly sense. And usually it involves sending money to the prosperity preacher, and that will be a way that God will, a concrete sign that God's going to reward you in return.
No Confederate currency accepted.
Probably, unless it happens to have a historic value of some kind.
All right. Well, Mario?
Well, so you argue saying that our culture, the American culture, have given some support to this kind of gospel. So there is a culture there, so from which this idea have come from. Would you mind to define that culture and what are those characteristics that allow this way of thinking the gospel begin?
Yeah, for some time I've used the definition of culture as a sort of a touchstone that one of the earliest English anthropologists, Edward Tyler, formulated in the 1870s. And he wrote, culture is that complex whole which includes knowledge, beliefs, arts, morals, law, customs, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. And that's usually considered to be the first example of the anthropological meaning of culture in the English language. It was a concept that was being worked out in the 19th century, chiefly in Germany and England. And Tyler was probably the first person to express it in English. So what are the characteristics that make it American culture open to the prosperity gospel? Well, I have to emphasize that without original sin, without the fall of our first parents, of course, we wouldn't have this problem that underlies all the ills of the human race. But having said that, there are some cultures that are more prone to certain faults than others. And in the United States, I think there are two things which have opened us to being friendly to the prosperity gospel. One is the radical individualism of the Protestantism that came here. I mean, the Protestants that came, especially to New England and the middle colonies, they considered the Anglican Church to be anathema because it was too close to the Catholic Church, and there was a very radical Protestantism. And even though originally in New England the society was very heavily structured and rigid, latent in that was a kind of individualism, because when you have individual interpretation of the Bible, and essentially every Christian becomes their own interpreter of the Bible, then no matter how long you try to hide that by various social structures, eventually the individualism is going to come out. And secondly, I talk in my book about the tremendous influence of John Locke in this country, who in his notion of society took away any kind of a transcendental purpose from society as a whole. Society is just concerned with protection of property and liberty, and whatever transcendence exists is purely on an individual level. And when you have this double font of individualism, you open the way for any one thing anyone wants. And one of these things is greed. That's why I say it's greed and bad philosophy. They go hand in hand.
Well, getting more focused. Talk about culture is so broad and so necessary. Getting more focused. What's bourgeois culture, and also what's a consumerist culture? Both of those notions come up in your discussions.
Well, bourgeois is an interesting term because it's meant different things at different times. I don't know if you're familiar with Christopher Dawson's amazingly wonderful essay, Catholicism and the Bourgeois Mind, in which he talks about what he calls the incompatibility between the bourgeois outlook and the Catholic outlook. But he says that bourgeois, of course, originally meant simply the people who lived in the cities, and like the German burgher. But it's come to have a connotation of somebody who is interested in material things, conventionality, a non-heroic approach to life. And Dawson, in that essay I just mentioned, talks about the bourgeois English of the early Baroque, and contrasts that with the Latin Catholic countries, where there was this spirit of heroism, of giving all for God, or sometimes all for something that was not God, but was still an heroic ideal, and very different from the English kind of, this audio honesty is the best policy sort of attitude.
Now, just an aside here, could you give us a mini bio of Christopher? He's someone that we need to know more about that we've forgotten.
Dawson was, his dates were, I believe, 1889 to 1970, and he was born as a Protestant in England, and he converted, I believe, while he was at Oxford, and he took a history degree at Oxford. He didn't spend most of his life as an academic, but rather as a private scholar with periods of teaching. And he wrote a number of seminal books, Religion and the Rise of Western Culture, this collection of essays of his called Dynamics of World History that a disciple of his, John Malloy, put together is one of the most interesting ones. That's the one that contains the essay Catholicism and the Bourgeois Mind. And Dawson made really fruitful use as an historian of anthropology in his works. He was someone who didn't separate the two fields, but he saw that the anthropological approach really revealed a lot about how the faith, the Catholic faith, and in fact any religion, would influence the larger culture. That every religion, every culture rather, he argued, is based upon a religious outlook of one way or the other. And that was one of his chief themes. During World War II, he was editor of the Dublin Review for a while. And then, surprisingly late in life, he was offered a post at Harvard University as a professor of Catholic studies. And he held that post for about 3 or 4 years until poor health forced him to resign and return to England. But his daughter, by the way, wrote a biography of him with the title of something like, I can't remember the exact title, but her name is Scott, Christine Scott, if anyone wants to look up that biography of Dawson, of her father.
You know, Peter Morin must have been reading Christopher Dawson when he coined that expression, cult, culture, and cultivation.
Yeah, it's interesting that, you know, the concept of culture was, as I said before, a relatively late one in Western intellectual history, but was used very fruitfully by Catholics. Dawson, Hilaire Belloc used it back in the 19th century. That Spanish philosopher Jaime Balmes contrasted Catholic and Protestant countries. I'm not sure whether he explicitly used the term culture, but he was writing about culture, whether he used the term or not.
And Pope John Paul II has a really important definition of culture that you draw on.
Yeah, at the heart of it's similar to what Dawson said. At the heart of every culture is an approach to the mystery of God and of creation and of reality as a whole. That's why that quotation that I bring up from Justice Anthony Kennedy is so radically opposed to that, because instead of saying at the heart of every culture, there is a notion of the mystery of God and of creation. He says, well, you can have your own version of that, and everybody has his own version of that, and that's just fine.
I see. Yes, Mario.
I have a question. Otherwise, we move from different places. But when I read the word bourgeois, generally it's meant to compare with the culture, which is, I don't know what it is. It's a culture made by peasant farmers. So that expression was used very often by Marxists. So there was a bourgeois society which began, let's say, in the 1800s and in the 18th century, and move along and start spreading out all over the world. So it seems that refer to different social classes. Now, and also you say, well, that may be, Maritain said that came from Rousseau. I don't know if that's accurate, but anyhow, my point is that how then we are going to apply this language to a culture, again, very complex word, to the first settler of the United States, the Puritans, for instance. Were these people really bourgeois in the same way that we refer in the 19th century bourgeois? Or are we just, I don't know, would you mind clarifying a little bit about that?
Yeah, I said before that the early New England settlers, the Pilgrims, or more accurately separatists, and the Puritans, did not, in their societies, were not radically individualists. Their societies were in fact very rigid and controlled. What I said was that latent in their theology was an individualism that came out later via contradictions in their theology. Even, for example, when it became very difficult for the children of the Puritans to say, well, we had a conversion experience, and you had that so-called halfway covenant where people who were children of the original settlers could still be members of the church, even though they hadn't had the kind of Calvinist conversion experience that their parents had had. So, yeah, I agree with you that the kind of bourgeois civilization that Dawson was talking about, and that, to be honest with you, I can't recall if I used the word bourgeois, but I certainly used the word commercial in my book. But the kind of commercial civilization that arose in the 19th century and 20th century is not the same as the early Puritan civilization. Yeah, I acknowledge that fact. But what I'm saying is that the individualism that gave rise to the bourgeois civilization was latent in the New England settlers. And that kind of fused with the Lockeanism in a very strange amalgam.
Valerie, you're with us.
Yay.
All right.
Can you hear me?
Hi.
Yes.
Okay, my son brought me one of these fancy little clips that for some reason.
Whoa.
Yes.
We'll get to technology later.
Yeah.
Yes, we will. But we've so far been discussing, I don't know with your tech problems, whether you've been able to hear us or not. We've been talking about, of course, what counts as the prosperity gospel. And then really struggling with the notion of culture, bourgeois culture, consumerist culture. Any thoughts on any of those terms before we go ahead?
I always say that we're consumed with consumption. So I've heard, it's just a phrase that comes to mind, that we are kind of a people who are in America in this generation and this time in history. I feel like we're consumed with consumption. I heard you talk a lot about bourgeois. Is there anything else you would say about a culture of consumption?
Well, yeah, I mean, John Locke basically said that the society, the state, and by implication society, had no interest in anything that was transcendent, but merely in protecting people's property. He was giving a kind of a sanction to what later became, and what was becoming, even at that time as he wrote, a bourgeois civilization. And when you had Lockeanism, as I said, fused with Protestant individualism, the radical kind, it came out in a very strange mix. I mean, I don't think there's anywhere else in the world, maybe now, but not even 20 years ago, that wouldn't have found the prosperity gospel to be utterly bizarre. And said, what a weird thing this must be. But in the United States, no. Certainly there are people who see it as weird, but it has a surprising following here. I wanted to call it, my book originally, Seedbed of the Prosperity Gospel. I thought that would express what I was trying to get across, namely that it found welcome soil here, and it found welcome soil because of these two elements that I've been going over and mentioning again and again, radical Protestantism and Lockeanism.
All right. Now we got to get another name into the mix here. Max Weber.
Well, Weber was a German sociologist, and he died, I believe, around 1920. And he's most famous for, at least in this country, for his book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, which is by no means the only book that tries to talk about the relationship between the theology and the social order or culture, but it's one of the most famous, certainly, maybe the most famous. And Weber's thesis is that Protestantism, especially Calvinism, has given rise to what he calls the Protestant ethic, in the sense of a culture that looks upon money making not only as a pleasure but as a duty, really, and traps us, most of us, into this what he calls at one point an iron cage of a life dedicated to money making, even if it isn't even fun anymore. just for the sake of more. Ebenezer Scrooge, I suppose, would be an example of that, who doesn't enjoy life at all, but is focused on that one thing, making more money. And I find Weber's book very useful and interesting, especially some of the examples he gives. We tend to think that the attitude toward riches that we have is sort of endemic to the human race. In fact, you can find that in Adam Smith, who I think took a subset of humanity, late 18th century Scotland and England, and generalized from that to the whole mankind, which was not a mistake. So Weber, for example, talks about in mid-19th century Germany, cloth merchants who were content with their income. They weren't always looking for ways to make more. They weren't always looking to cut corners or cut costs or something like that. As long as they had their ordinary income, they were satisfied, and their life was fairly leisurely. But then when somebody came along, say a young guy, and said, if I work harder, if I do this and that, I can make more money, and that kind of forced the others to do the same thing, or else they would go out of business. So Weber's book is full of all kinds of interesting insights like that, and it's one of the seminal works for somebody who's interested in a relationship between culture, theology, and economics.
All right, more background, crucial background. Mario?
I have when you talk about again, consumerist culture, bourgeois culture, do you think that those who are proponent of the prosperity gospel are part of this consumerist culture?
Yes.
In America. In other words, when you go to these churches where they preach the prosperity culture, are those really part of this consumerist culture, or is just a way of thinking about the gospel in order to work hard, be prosperous, have the luck to make money and all that? Because when I hear them, it seems to me that at least some of them, yes, they preach about success, they preach about having good results, but at the same time, also they preach to save money, and be the sobriety and so on, because that is go along with have money. So in other words, I don't see in some of them at least the culture you see in other way of living in Europe, in Latin America, where consumerist culture is practiced by those who don't believe in anything other than in hedonism. So how then you explain that, or is accurate what I'm describing?
Well, if I understand your question, Mario, there are different aspects to consumerist culture. I mean, you mentioned saving and working hard, and certainly that is one of the components of this. It's not the only component. Spending is also a component of this, and it would differ in different streams of this. I mean, Weber talks about this, how you can have not just, you can have these people who are so set on earning and saving and amassing riches that they don't even enjoy their riches. On the other hand, you can have people who are profligate. I mean, people have talked about the contradictions of capitalism that undermine itself, because if you save too much and you don't spend, then you destroy the economic engine that fuels capitalism. So yeah, those elements are all there. I don't think that undermines what I'm arguing. It just says that it's a complex phenomenon, and there are different elements to it. Some that emphasize more spending, some that emphasize more saving. And that's why I say some people see that as an inherent contradiction in the heart of capitalism. Because if you, as I said, if you save, then you can't spend. If you can't spend, then the economy collapses. Since most of it is posited on individual spending, most of which is not exactly for necessities.
I'm thinking of President Bush the first. It was President Bush the second, after 9/11, encouraging us to take heart and get out and spend money.
Right. I think he said go to Disneyland, go to Disney World.
Valerie, your turn.
I was in listening. I was thinking of, part of it is it.
Oh, we're stuck again.
Okay, so you can't hear me.
I can't understand you.
Only a little bit.
Okay, so
Yes.
no? Yes. Okay. Maybe I need to turn. Okay. Anyway, so thinking about arduous goods, like as you were speaking, Mario, I was thinking, well, depending on what the end result is, what's hard, okay, sacrifice for something.
We're losing it again. I'm sorry.
Does somebody else take it from here, and I'll try. I think I'm going to join with my phone.
All right. Call in. Let me, while Valerie's shifting here, let me ask a little bit about the Protestant side of the Protestant ethic. I was wondering what it would be like to dialogue with Protestants about the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. I would think that would be a dialogue of some complexity. For example, we have, I think of them as quintessential Protestants, the Amish, and the whole Anabaptist tradition, which seems to me to go counter to individualism. And then in the first part of the last century, I think of the rise of the social gospel. And that too, as I understand it, was initially a Protestant phenomenon. And then a century earlier, I just happened to reread. You know how you have this list of things that you should read that you read when you were a kid, and now you should read them when you're growing up? Not that I've grown up entirely, but when I was a kid, I read George Eliot, aka Marianne Evans' book, Middlemarch. And one of the things that was central to Middlemarch was to give a really panoramic view of a quintessential British city. And it was named Middlemarch. Well, there are all sorts of twists and turns in Middlemarch, but the richest person in Middlemarch was the banker, Nicholas Bulstrode, the banker. And no one much liked him. And among other reasons people had for not liking him was that he was evangelical in an in-your-face way. He was piocious more than pious, and a terrible scandal finally engulfed Nicholas Bulstrode. It turns out that he had the money to start the bank because he was involved in big-time fencing of stolen goods. So here we have a novel written by a Protestant writer, although she left her evangelical roots. And a central theme in the novel was the criticism of, well, you could call it the spirit of capitalism, and the more than suggestion that capitalism got its start by way of stealing. Does that go against the notion, it seems to, go against the notion that Protestantism somehow organically gives rise to capitalism.
No, I don't think so. Although there are certain different kinds of Protestantism, I admit that. And the kind we're talking about, or I'm talking about, primarily is the Calvinist tradition. But sure, you're going to have individuals, and even whole, eventually by the 19th century, whole intellectual trends that were critical of this, that saw through it, that criticized it. But as you point out, in the case of George Eliot, she left her Christian roots, her Protestant roots, and this was true of many others. But the people someone who's raised in a Protestant culture tends to either embrace it or utterly reject it. And if they utterly reject it, not always, but very often, they will reject any form of Christianity because their understanding of Christianity, even if they have some intellectual knowledge that yes, there's something called Catholicism, and yes, it happens to have more adherents than Protestants do. Nonetheless, they're somewhere deep in their psyche, they identify Christianity with Calvinism and Protestantism. So you have someone like D.H. Lawrence, who raised in the English Protestant milieu, rejected it and criticized it in many ways quite acutely. But sure, I don't see any contradiction between saying that individuals and even, as I say, even social trends saw through this. It simply means that you have some individuals who are, see clearly.
Well, that leaves the Amish. Would you say that the Anabaptist tradition is really pre-capitalist?
I suppose I don't know that much about the Amish, but from what I do know, I would say, yeah, that they are not to be. I don't think that. I don't know whether I don't think that they're Calvinist in their theology. I'm not certain about that. And somebody else knows, please enlighten me. But they certainly had a different stream. I mean, their origins are not Calvin. Their origins are, I think, pre-Calvinist and probably embodied certain medieval trends. And because they've been so isolated, and they are able to maintain these things. So again, I don't see the existence of the Amish as arguing against my thesis, because they have not been determinative of culture in the United States.
All right. Now, Valerie, you're back. We only have 20 minutes left, and it's all yours.
Oh, right. Yeah.
But feel free to share whatever thoughts you have other than cursing technology. That's one of the things that Thomas is inviting us to do. No. Go ahead.
Thanks. So what I was trying to say earlier was just that, what the value we give something determines what we're willing to sacrifice, right, in order to get it. And so like this question of, well, if we value prosperity, again, somebody may be less inclined to save, somebody might be more inclined to save. But, and when we were talking about that, the idea of arduous goods came to mind, right? Like in our culture, I'm often thinking how in our culture, people are willing to sacrifice greatly for certain things, like for instance, athletic honor, right? Or just educational degrees, et cetera, where we're willing to pour tons of hours and time and hard efforts, again, arduous goods, right? We perceive these to be a good, and therefore I'm willing to sacrifice tremendously to pursue it. But we're not willing, for instance, to, again, in a culture where, in a pregnancy, we think that a baby in the womb is disposable. We don't see that as a good. We don't see that baby as a good or worth sort of the risks and the arduousness, right, of bringing that baby into the world. And so this question of teleology, right? How does it relate? Like how we see the end or the purpose of things. Am I right in teleology being about the end of things? What's the purpose or the end of things? How does this and our understanding of the end or the purpose of various aspects of our lives, how does that play into this conversation about culture and individualism and all the things we've been talking about today?
Yeah, that's a excellent. I'm glad you brought up that point, because that's one of the big points of my book, is how the our culture has no public consensus about ends, about ultimate purposes. It doesn't even have a conversation about it. It, again, thanks to Locke and others, I'm sure, has privatized the idea of purpose. But a Catholic is going to see the ultimate teleology as attaining heaven, and everything else, every other good, is going to have a proper place under that ultimate attainment, the ultimate end, and in reference to it. So we can't say, I'm going to pursue riches as an end in itself. No, riches has a place, at least material goods have a place, but that place is subordinate to our attainment of heaven. Education, the intellectual life, everything has a place under, but again, in reference to that ultimate telos, the ultimate end. But we in this country, we privatize that conversation. It's not, there's no consensus. It's again, as Justice Kennedy said, everyone is free to have his own conception of that, and that's held to be the essence of our freedom.
Yeah. So what do you think would be a how do you, because what you're proposing is that we need to set aside this the higher in the hierarchy of what we value and what we pursue, for instance. How do we do you have ideas as to how to help people essentially embrace what is arduous about knocking prosperity or off of the top of the totem pole or whatever? How do you envision a culture that does encourage people to embrace the hardness of a culture that's not based on consumption and comfort, and ease?
Well, we're all tremendously influenced by our culture. Certain things that just seem obvious to us, and it's because they're in the air, so to speak, culturally. And so a culture that did have an understanding of our ultimate end and did try to subordinate the other activities of human life to that ultimate end would give us a lot of encouragement for embracing arduous tasks that are not necessarily pleasant to us. But when you don't have that cultural support, then it takes a strong individual to withstand that cultural pressure. You might feel like you're a fool. I mean, you do that? Really? You had a chance to make a buck and you didn't take it? Really? You're a fool. And that's, even if somebody doesn't actually say that to you, in the back of your mind, there's a voice saying, you could have had this sexual experience and you didn't take it, or you could have had this opportunity of making money and you didn't take it, and you're really foolish. And we need as social beings, whom God intended to live in community, we need the support of culture. We're not doing this on our own. Sure, it's possible to be holy in any society, but it's much harder. That's something I think Jim mentioned Peter Morin before, and Peter Morin said he wanted a society in which it was easier to be good. And I think that's what we need to aim at, a society in which it's easier to be good because we have the cultural supports promoting that.
And so how does technology play into this? Does it make it easier to be good? Harder to be good?
Well,
easier to be frustrated.
It's often said that technology is neutral. In fact, I was having just yesterday or Monday, I had another radio interview, and one of the hosts said technology is neutral. I said, well, no, it isn't. It's not neutral. Given the proclivities that we've inherited from the fall of our first parents, we have a tendency to take the easy way out and to not look at the long range consequences of things. And so I'm not against technology altogether. If we had no technology, we'd be living in caves and drinking water out of our cupped hands and eating raw vegetables. What I'm against is the development of technology without any consideration of its consequences. And an excellent example is the automobile. And despite what it seems, I'm not explicitly taking a view here for or against the automobile. I'm saying the automobile has transformed our lives incredibly. It's transformed the very physical structure of our cities, taking up all this land with parking lots, superhighways. It's made it easy for people to live very far from where they work, and it helped separate families and neighborhoods and so on. Well, maybe that was good. Maybe it was worth it being able to get from point A to point B faster. Maybe all this stuff was worth it because getting from point A to point B was so important that it didn't matter what else happened. But my point is, we never had the conversation about that. We never discussed, well, gee, here's a new invention. It does a really good job of getting us from A to B, but what are some of the ramifications of this invention? And I dare say that even back in the first part of the 20th century, there were some people who could have pointed that out, would have said, if we embrace this invention, these are some of the likely things that are going to happen. But we never had that conversation. We just uncritically embraced it the way we uncritically embrace most technology without any thought about what it's going to do.
All right, Mario.
You talk about technology is not neutral. What do you think about the claim that science is not neutral? Excuse me, science is neutral. So what we need is good science, which is neutral.
Well, that opens up another question. You'll recall when I was the last time on the show, Mario, we talked about that book Everywhen, and we talked about some of the meanings of science. And I've been very influenced by the philosopher of science, Thomas Kuhn, that I'm sure you're familiar with. And I think a lot of his criticisms of science are correct. And interestingly enough, C.S. Lewis made the same criticisms as Kuhn in one of his last books, The Discarded Image. So I think that science, the sign of science we've had in Europe and its extensions since Galileo and his contemporaries has been oriented toward technology. That's been its justification. And in fact, you'll find a lot of popular justifications of science are not about whatever knowledge we allegedly have gotten from it, but simply about, well, look at all the stuff it's given us. And again, we have to ask, is this stuff worthwhile? Has it been good for us? Maybe it has, maybe it hasn't, but we've never talked about it. We never discussed it. And so science, the kind of science we have now, which we tend to think is the only kind of science or the best kind of science, is not necessarily either. And so we need to have a more fundamental conversation about what is science and what its purpose is. Because I think you're aware that you brought up the excellent point that when you were getting your education in South America, the older notion of science was still the one that was assumed, namely that the highest sciences are philosophy and theology, not physics.
Let me. I'm going to interrupt you. The question that I ask is very. Is very. How can I say? Has a lot of weight today in Latin America, which means that because the fragmentation of societies, the constitutional system must be based, that's the claim, in a neutral way of thinking the law. So the jurist who is coming back in many ways is Hans Kelsen. In other words, we need to get rid of all the emotions, religions, any value that can somehow contaminate the legal system or the constitutional system so that we can have a pure theory of the law. And so, because the claim is, again, in this world, science is everything. Therefore, science must be neutral. Otherwise, it's going to take sides, and then we have the populism, different type of system that we see around. So in that sense, I think that idea is very prevalent. Perhaps it's less in the United States, but in Latin America, interesting enough, the enlightenment, hardcore enlightenment is coming back with a lot of strength.
Well, I think if it doesn't seem so common in the U.S., it's because it's just accepted. It's just assumed. I mean, the separation between being and morality is one of the postulates of modern philosophy. And philosophy, as you know well, better than I, that's why modern philosophy has struggles with the idea of morality. And where do you fit it in? It's not a thing. And yet we know that that's false. And we have to go back to a different metaphysics and show that no, the morality is based on being. In fact, it's convertible with being. The good is convertible with being, and yet when you have a whole civilization based on the idea that on a positivistic way of looking at reality, then there are lots of ramifications for that. And I would guess, although you could correct me on this, I would guess that the reason that this is an acute subject of discussion in Latin America is because it's as an import from the Anglo-Saxon world. It's seen for what it is, and it's seen not as just part of the background of culture the way it is here, but it's seen for a new idea that needs to be accepted or rejected or whatever. But it's not just simply accepted as a given. There are an awful lot of things that we accept as givens in this culture, and I'm sure every culture does. But we have givens that we just assume are part of the nature of things, and they're not.
Yeah, thank you.
Let me suggest something that's pretty doggone dismal. I have a couple of friends that are very involved in John Ruskin studies. And Ruskin began as an art critic in the 1800s and moved into a more general criticism of cultural developments in England and in Europe. And for a time he had a hearing, but the more direct his criticisms became of the materialism of his culture, the more and more he lost that hearing. And I think his readers continue to this day more because of his art criticism than anything else. But someone might say the general sort of discussion we've had this morning is something that Ruskin had in the 1800s. And someone might say, well, that discussion is something really that the Amish, the Anabaptist tradition, was pursuing in the 1600s. And then someone might say, by the way, have you read today's Public Discourse, which is a service that I recommend? In today's Public Discourse, the theme of the article was, have you noticed that the decline of the humanities goes hand in hand with the decline in religious participation? And do you ever wonder why the decline of the one goes hand in hand with the decline of the other? Author's suggestion? Well, because it's a loss of a sense of teleology. What we have in the STEM focus in contemporary education, which has completely dwarfed the humanities. I think I mentioned before that full-time enrollment in a humanities major in the United States of America today is now a robust 7%. And the humanities covers a whole lot of disciplines. Well, at any rate, says the author in today's Public Discourse, this is because we're constantly looking for the utility of means. And we've pretty much given up questions about the end that these means ought to serve. So you're saying, Thomas, that we haven't had the conversation, but now here's my dismal thought. Yeah, we have. We've had this conversation before many times, and every time the side of good, truth, and beauty has not fared very well. which leads me back to our discussion of that I think Valerie was initiating. How could we change this? And it seems to me that, well, Aristotle would say that if you're looking for the best kind of moral teaching, you look for outstanding people who are truly prudent. They can give us the measure that we need to have. And so now this gets really dismal. If we think we're right, we got a hell of a lot of work to do. We got to live out. We got to live out our commitments. And I've been thinking about doing that. Maybe next year. So in the last couple of minutes, who could say something encouraging?
Well, I won't say anything encouraging. I'm not. I don't have a plan, but
What? No plan?
no plan. But certainly, it would be nice. To think that Catholics would start appropriating these things themselves, rather than just simply being what Cardinal George of Chicago said a few years ago, cultural Calvinists. But I don't see too many signs that we're headed in that direction, unfortunately, of embracing a truly Catholic culture. I mean, even the most traditionalist Catholics, for all I think there's a lot to be said for the traditional Mass. Basically, most of them are quite content otherwise to be Calvinists with a beautiful liturgy.
Mario, you're poised. Go for it, guy. Go for it.
A question related to the the exaggeration of technology today and the decline of humanities. What do you think are the consequences of that phenomenon? Because when you teach today, I remember 20 years ago, you just wait one day in order to fill your class in humanities. Today, you need to struggle and promote everywhere that what you are teaching somehow is meaningful. I don't know, you persuade people, but that is what happened. In other words, programs like I used to teach, Western Civ, were required. Today, they are optional. And nobody really wants to enroll. And so the whole culture seems to suffer, I don't know, of this phenomenon. What do you think will be the consequence of that in the short term and long term?
Well, I think it was Chesterton or maybe others who said, everybody has a philosophy, even if he doesn't think he has a philosophy. So what you're going to get is not an educated citizenry who has no philosophy, but an educated citizenry that has a really crappy philosophy and doesn't know it. A philosophy that's basically positivistic and scientistic, and that doesn't even have any idea it has such a philosophy. So, and never thinks about these questions. And the consequences of that for all culture, for politics, will be not good. People who don't think about things, because you're just, you have to have ultimate desires, whether it's prosperity gospel or whether it's heaven or somewhere in between. But if you don't know that you have a teleological outlook, then you're worse off. It'd be better if people said, yeah, for me, the telos is money. At least you can talk to someone like that. At least you can have a conversation, or at least maybe you can. But yeah, you're gonna have people whose whole idea of the intellectual life is simply, how can I make bigger, fill in the blank, bombs, toasters, iPads, whatever. That's what college is about, learning how to do that. And it's really incredible, actually. But that's most of the conversation about higher education is about how you can make more money if you get a college degree. And I don't think your Western Civ course is going to help them.
Well, we can close as we always do to today's gospel, turn to today's gospel, which tells us about the start of a certain kind of discipleship. This comes from Matthew Jesus summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to drive them out and to cure every disease and every illness. The names of the 12 apostles are these: first, Simon called Peter and his brother Andrew, James the son of Zebedee and his brother John, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanian, and Judas Iscariot betrayed Jesus. Jesus sent out these 12 after instructing them thus: do not go into pagan territory or enter a Samaritan town. Go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. As you go, make this proclamation: the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Come, Lord Jesus, come.
You.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me on here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Valerie, you missed Tom's story. Well, it's kind of a riddle, actually. Tom's riddle about one of our fellow mammals who's sales resistant. He put it this way: why is it that you can't sell shoes to bears? Why is it that you can't sell shoes to bears? And Mario and I, we were confounded. And then Tom said, they prefer to go barefoot.
Well, it's too much for the midst of the summer.
All right. As we say, forward lurch.
Yeah, thank you, gentlemen. Sorry for the technical difficulties on my end. It was a good conversation. I heard most of it, so
I know that you're fluent in Spanish. So as I told Mario, si no es una cosa maldita, pues hay otra cosa maldita. If it's not one damn thing, it's another damn thing.
Okay. Take care.
Take care.
have a great day, gentlemen.
Yep.